There is a knowledge in you that you did not learn. You have always known this. You have just never had a name for it. You meet someone for the first time and something in you relaxes, as if a door you didn't know was locked has quietly opened. You walk into a place you have never been, and your body slows down, the way it slows down in a room it already trusts. You feel a fear that has no event behind it, no memory you can point to, no moment where it began, just the fear, fully formed, waiting in you before you were old enough to have earned it. You learn something, a skill, an instrument, a language, and some part of it does not feel like learning. It feels like remembering, like your hands already knew where to go before you told them to move there. None of this is imagination, none of this is coincidence stacked carefully enough to look like meaning. There is a name for what is happening to you. It is not magic, it is not superstition. It is something closer to architecture. The architecture of a forgetting that was never total, a door that was closed but never sealed. Some people spend their whole lives bumping into that door without knowing it has a name. By the end of this hour, you will know what to call it. You will know why it exists, what it is protecting you from, and, more importantly, what it has been quietly letting through the entire time. If you are still listening, some part of you already suspects this is about you. It is. Chapter 1. The Veil, Not the Erasure. Most people assume that birth wipes the slate clean, that whatever came before, if anything came before, is gone, erased, inaccessible because it no longer exists. This is the first thing to correct, and it is worth correcting carefully, because the entire rest of this hour depends on getting it right. Nothing about a forgotten memory means the memory is gone. Think of a song you knew once completely and cannot recall now. You have not lost the song, you have lost access to it. If 3 notes were played right now, you would know the 4th before it arrived. The song is still complete, it is only unreachable on command. This is the difference between erasure and veiling, and it is not a small difference. It is the difference between a fact and a condition. An erasure is permanent, a veil is a placement. Something is put in front of something else, on purpose, for a reason. And anything placed on purpose can, under the right conditions, be seen around. This is the first claim worth sitting with. What you call forgetting was never the absence of memory. It was a condition of this lifetime, placed deliberately, for a purpose that has nothing to do with punishment and everything to do with function. Call it the forgetting, not as a flaw, as a structure. Here is what the forgetting actually does, stripped of any mystical language. It allows you to enter a new set of circumstances without the full weight of every other set of circumstances pressing down on your judgment at the same time. Picture an actor who remembers, in full emotional detail, exactly how the last performance ended. Every mistake, every triumph, every audience reaction, and carries all of it onto the stage for a brand new role. That actor cannot fully become the new character. They are too occupied being the sum of every character they have ever played. The forgetting is what allows a soul to fully arrive, not partially, not while dragging the complete inventory of every outcome it has ever lived through. This is not erasure as cruelty. This is a clearance as a function. But, and this is where the architecture becomes interesting, the forgetting is not absolute. It was never designed to be absolute. A wall has no doors, a veil has weave. If the forgetting were total, there would be no déjà vu, no instant recognition of a stranger, no fear with no event behind it, no skill that arrives faster than learning should be allowed. These things exist, you have felt them, which means the veil, whatever it is, has gaps in its weave, deliberate ones. Why would something designed to clear you of the past leave gaps for the past to leak through? This is the question worth holding on to, because the answer changes how you understand every unexplained moment of recognition you have ever had. Here is a different way to think about it. A veil that blocked everything would not protect you. It would be isolating you. There is a difference between shielding someone from being overwhelmed and cutting them off entirely from what they need. The forgetting was never built to cut you off. It was built to filter, to let through exactly what serves the present, while holding back the flood that would otherwise drown it. This means every unexplained moment of recognition you have ever had was not a glitch in the system. It was the system working correctly, a controlled leak, not an accident. Consider what this reframes. The fear with no origin is not irrational. It is information that arrived without its file attached. The skill that felt like remembering instead of learning is not luck. It is a groove that was already worn smooth, somewhere the deliberate part of your mind cannot reach, but your hands apparently can. None of this requires you to believe in anything you cannot already feel evidence for. You have felt these leaks. You have lived inside several of them without naming them. The only thing missing was the name, and now you have one. The forgetting. A veil, not an erasure. A filter, not a wall. A condition placed on this lifetime so that you could meet it directly, without the unbearable weight of every other lifetime answering the door for you. But a question remains, and it is the harder one. If the forgetting exists to protect you from being overwhelmed, why does it ever let anything through at all? Why not seal completely? Why leave gaps for old fear, old recognition, old skill to leak into a life that was supposed to be met fresh? Either the leaks are mistakes in an otherwise perfect system, or the leaks are the point. That is where this goes next. Chapter 2. The leaks are the point. Picture a room with the lights off. You cannot see the furniture, but you know it is there. You move through the dark carefully, hands out, expecting an edge to meet your palm before it does. Some part of you has already mapped the room, even though no light has confirmed a single piece of it. Then your hand finds the corner of a table exactly where it was supposed to be. That moment, the hand finding what it already expected to find, is the closest thing to what a leak in the forgetting feels like. Not a surprise, a confirmation. Something in you already knew, and the world simply caught up to what you knew. This is the shape the leaks take. Not random noise breaking through a wall, confirmations arriving on schedule from a source you cannot see of things you could not have learned any other way. In Chapter 1, the leaks were framed as a question. Why would a system built to clear you of the past leave gaps for the past to come through? Here is the answer, and it requires a small shift in how you think about what the forgetting is actually for. The forgetting was never designed to protect you from your own history. It was designed to protect you from being unable to function under the weight of all of it at once. Those are not the same thing. A surgeon does not forget anatomy in order to operate. A surgeon forgets the anxiety of every previous operation in order to have steady hands for this one. The knowledge stays. The paralyzing weight of accumulated outcome does not. This is what the forgetting filters, not the knowledge itself, the weight. And this is why the leaks exist on purpose, not by accident. Knowledge without weight is not dangerous. It is useful. A fear with no traceable origin in this lifetime is not the same as the original event that caused it. The event stayed behind the veil, exactly where it belongs. What leaked through is only the signal, information with the file removed. This is the first kind of leak worth naming precisely. Call it the echo, recognition with no rational explanation. You meet someone, and your body relaxes before your mind has gathered a single fact to justify the relaxation. You walk into a building you have never entered, and something in you slows down, the way you slow down somewhere already trusted. The echo is not a memory surfacing. It is the residue of a memory, present without its details, the way the warmth of a fire reaches you before you have located the fire itself. The second kind of leak is different in texture. Call it the ghost skill, an ability that arrives faster than learning should allow. You sit at an instrument you have never played, and your hands find something that resembles fluency before your conscious mind has assembled the rules. You pick up a language, and certain structures feel less like new information and more like vocabulary you mislaid, rather than vocabulary you never had. The ghost skill is not a talent in the ordinary sense. Ordinary talent is the absence of a struggle others have. The ghost skill is the presence of a groove, something worn smooth by use, somewhere the deliberate mind cannot reach, but the hands apparently can. The third kind of leak is the hardest to live with, because it offers no comfort and no clear use. Call it the old fear. A fear with no traceable origin in this lifetime's events, not a phobia you can trace to a specific moment, a fear that was simply present, fully formed, before you were old enough to have earned it through experience. Most people treat the old fear as a malfunction, something to medicate, suppress, or explain away with a childhood incident vague enough to fit the shape of the fear retroactively. But notice what the old fear has in common with the echo and the ghost skill. All three arrive with their information intact and their origin removed. All three are leaks, not malfunctions. The only difference is that fear is harder to receive gracefully than recognition or skill, because fear demands an explanation, the way the others do not. This is the deeper claim of this chapter, and it is worth stating plainly. The leaks are not exceptions to the forgetting. They are evidence that the forgetting is working exactly as intended. A system that blocked everything would not be protection, it would be isolation. The forgetting was never built to seal you off from everything that came before. It was built to let through precisely what serves you now, while holding back precisely what would overwhelm you now. The echo, the ghost skill, and the old fear are not glitches in that filter. They are the filter doing its job. This reframes something that matters. If the leaks are intentional, then your unexplained recognitions, your inexplicable competencies, and your originless fears are not random debris floating up from somewhere unknowable. They are signals, specific, targeted, arriving exactly when something in your present circumstances calls for exactly that signal, which raises a sharper question than the one this chapter opened with. If the leaks are targeted, if they arrive because something in your present life calls for them, what is doing the calling? Not the past. The past has no hands. It cannot reach forward and select what gets through. Something in your present has to be doing the asking. And the place that question leads next is the place where the leaks stop being abstract and start having faces. Chapter 3. The person who feels like memory. People say it was love at first sight. That is not quite it. What actually happens in that first moment is closer to recognition than to love, and recognition is not the same thing as falling in love. Falling in love takes time, even when it feels instant. Recognition does not take time. It is already finished the moment it happens. You meet someone, and something in you says, "I know you." Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech for instant comfort. The sentence arrives whole, uninvited, before your conscious mind has gathered a single fact that would justify it. This is the echo from Chapter 2, but now it has a face attached to it, and a face changes everything about how a leak feels. Recognition through a place is unsettling but manageable. You can walk back out of a building. Recognition through a skill is mostly pleasant. A skill does not ask anything of you beyond practice. But recognition through a person is different in kind, because a person can want something back. A person can stay. A person can leave. The stakes of a leak multiply the moment it arrives wearing a face. Here is the claim worth sitting with for the rest of this chapter. Certain people carry a deeper groove in you than others do, and the depth of that groove is not something either of you chose in this lifetime. Think back to the ghost skill from Chapter 2, the groove worn smooth by use, somewhere the deliberate mind cannot reach, but the hands apparently can. Some grooves are worn by repetition with an object, an instrument, a language. But the deepest grooves are worn by repetition with another person. Shared context leaves a mark that facts alone do not leave, because shared context is layered. It is not one memory, but the residue of many, compressed into something that no longer has individual edges. This is why certain people feel less like a stranger and more like a continuation. Not because fate selected them, and not because anything was contractually owed between you. Because the groove between you is simply deeper than the groove most new people leave, the way a path walked 1,000 times wears lower into the ground than a path walked once. This raises the harder version of the question. If deep grooves explain why some people feel instantly familiar in a good way, they should also explain why some people feel instantly familiar in a devastating way. And they do. The relationship that burned hotter than two new acquaintances should have been able to generate. The conflict that arrived with an intensity that the actual disagreement did not seem to justify. The person who hurt you in a way that felt almost personal before they had been in your life long enough to know you personally. This is not evidence of fate assigning you a villain. It is evidence of a deep groove meeting circumstances capable of striking it. A shallow groove produces a shallow reaction, no matter what happens inside it. A deep groove amplifies whatever moves through it. Tenderness, yes, but also conflict, also rupture, also pain. This distinction matters enough to state plainly, because it is easy to get wrong in both directions. The intensity of a bond is not proof that the bond was destined. It is proof that the groove underneath it was already deep before the current relationship had time to dig one. Two different claims, only one of them is being made here. And this distinction matters for a second reason, one that deserves direct address rather than a careful sidestep. None of this is an argument that pain was deserved or that harm should be tolerated because the bond beneath it runs deep. A deep groove explains why a wound cuts further than it should. It does not justify the hand that made the cut. Recognizing the depth of a connection and excusing what happened inside it are two entirely different acts, and only the first one belongs to this chapter. What this chapter is actually offering is smaller and more specific than an excuse. It is an explanation for a particular kind of confusion, the confusion of feeling far more for or far more against someone than the length of the relationship seems to warrant. That confusion has an origin. It is not a character flaw in you for feeling it. It is the groove, doing what grooves do, amplifying whatever moves through it. There is a second layer to this chapter worth naming before it closes, because it answers a question the first layer leaves open. If grooves explain intensity, what explains specificity? Why this person and not another out of every stranger you will ever pass? The honest answer is narrower than the question wants it to be. Not every encounter is a leak. Most strangers remain exactly what they appear to be, new, unfamiliar, without weight. The echo activates selectively, and what selects it is resonance, not randomness. Something about the shape of this particular moment, this particular need, this particular unresolved thread in your present circumstances matches the shape of a groove that already exists. This returns to the question Chapter 2 ended on. Something in your present has to be doing the asking, and the answer, now visible, is this. The present asks for whatever unresolved thread it is currently working on, and the leak that answers is whichever groove already matches that thread's shape. This is not destiny selecting a person for you before you were born. This is resonance, operating the way resonance always operates, matching frequency to frequency, need to groove, without any contract required. Which leaves one piece unaddressed, and it is the piece this hour has been circling since the opening sentence. If none of this was assigned to you, fixed and unchangeable from the outside, then how much of it can you actually move? If the groove is real, is the groove all there is? Or is there still a question of what you do with what the groove brings you? That is the question the next chapter takes on directly. Chapter 4. What the groove does not decide. A word you have forgotten behaves strangely. Grasp for it directly, and it stays just out of reach, as if your reaching pushes it further away. Stop trying. Think about something else entirely, and it arrives on its own, uninvited, complete, exactly when you were no longer asking for it. This is worth holding on to, because it describes something true about every leak this hour has named so far. The echo, the ghost skill, the old fear. None of them respond to direct command. You cannot summon a leak by wanting one badly enough, but you are not as powerless in front of them as that fact makes it sound. Here is the distinction this chapter exists to draw, and it is the most important distinction in the entire hour. You do not control whether a leak arrives. You control what happens after it does. This sounds like a small concession. It is not. It is the entire hinge on which the rest of your life swings on. Consider what is actually fixed and what is actually open, now that 3 chapters have built the architecture. The forgetting is fixed. You did not choose it, and you cannot dissolve it by wanting to. The leaks are largely fixed in their occurrence. The echo, the ghost skill, and the old fear arrive on a schedule that resonates with sets, not a schedule you set by trying harder. Even the groove itself, the depth carved by whatever came before this lifetime, is fixed. You inherited its depth. You did not dig it yourself, not in the part of you that is doing the inheriting. What is not fixed is everything that happens once the leak has already arrived. When the old fear surfaces with no traceable origin, you have a choice the fear itself does not make for you. You can treat it as proof that something is wrong with you, evidence to be hidden and managed and apologized for. Or you can treat it as information arriving without its file attached, exactly as Chapter 2 described it, which changes nothing about the fear's intensity, but changes everything about what you do while standing inside it. When the echo arrives wearing a face, the person who feels like memory, examined fully in the last chapter, you have a choice. The recognition itself does not make for you. You can mistake the depth of the groove for a guarantee, assuming that anything this familiar must be safe, must be right, must be followed without question. Or you can recognize the depth of the groove as exactly what it is, evidence of history, not evidence of safety, and decide, with eyes open, what kind of relationship this particular person deserves from you now. The groove explains the pull. The groove does not decide what you do with the pull once you feel it. This is where free will actually lives in this architecture, and it lives in a smaller, more precise location than people generally expect. Not in whether the leak happens, not in which person triggers an echo, or which fear arrives without an origin. Free will lives in the half-second between the leak arriving and your response to it forming. That half-second is small. It does not feel like there is much room to work with. But it is the only room there has ever been for anyone in any system that has ever governed a human life, and it has always been enough room to change everything that follows. Here is why that half-second matters more than its size suggests. Every leak this hour has carried momentum from before it arrived. The old fear carries the momentum of whatever produced it. The echo carries the momentum of whatever groove it is moving through. Left alone, that momentum simply continues. Fear breeds avoidance, recognition breeds repetition. The groove deepens exactly the way it has always deepened, because nothing intervened to ask it to do anything different. The half-second is the only point in the entire system where momentum can be met by something other than itself. Not stopped, met. Redirected even slightly by a response that did not have to be automatic. This is not a small power disguised as a large one. It is the actual mechanism by which a groove either deepens further or finally begins to soften. A groove does not soften because you decide once that you are done with it. It softens because the half-second, met differently enough times, slowly changes the shape of what the groove produces the next time it is struck. None of this requires forgetting to lift. None of this requires you to recover the buried file behind the old fear or trace the exact history behind a given echo. The architecture was never asking you to remember everything. It was only ever asking what you do with what already leaks through, which is a far smaller, far more achievable task than the one most people assume is required of them. This reframes something Chapter 1 raised and never fully resolved. The forgetting filters weight, not knowledge. What this chapter adds is that the filtering does not stop at birth. It continues, moment by moment, in the half-second between a leak arriving and a response forming. Except now, for the first time in this architecture, you are the one doing some of the filtering. That is not nothing. It may, in fact, be the only thing that was ever actually yours to do. But knowing this intellectually and recognizing it in the moment it matters are two different skills, and the gap between them is where most people lose the thread. There is a particular feeling that arrives when the half-second is finally met differently, when an old groove gets struck, and for the first time, something other than the automatic response shows up instead. That feeling has a signature. It is unmistakable once you have felt it. That is what the next chapter is for. Chapter 5. The moment the groove goes quiet. There is a moment. You will know it when it arrives, because nothing else feels quite like it. The groove gets struck the way it has always been struck. The same kind of person, the same kind of disappointment, the same kind of fear surfacing in the same kind of circumstance. Everything about the setup is familiar. Everything about what should happen next has happened before, many times, in roughly the same shape. And then, for a fraction of a second, nothing happens. Not nothing as in numbness, not nothing as in suppression, the grim effort of forcing a reaction back down before it shows. Something closer to a pause that was not deliberately placed there, a gap that simply appeared where the automatic response used to live without one. This is the moment worth naming carefully, because it is easy to miss and easy to misdescribe once you notice it. It is not the absence of feeling. The fear is still there. The pull toward the familiar person is still there. The old reaction has not been deleted. What has changed is that it no longer arrives unaccompanied. For the first time, it arrives next to something else, a sliver of distance, thin as a single breath, where a different response has room to exist if you choose to let it. Chapter 4 called this the half-second. This chapter is about what it feels like when the half-second is finally met by something other than momentum. The first thing to notice is that it does not feel triumphant. People expect this moment to feel like victory, like a door swinging open with music behind it. It does not. It feels quiet, almost anticlimactic. The kind of quiet that makes you wonder, in the moment itself, whether anything actually happened at all. This is worth saying plainly, because the quietness is part of why the moment goes unrecognized so often. A groove finally meeting something other than its old momentum does not announce itself. It does not arrive with the emotional volume of the original wound. It arrives smaller than the moment that created the groove in the first place, and that size difference can feel like the moment doesn't count. It counts. Quiet is not the same as small in significance. It is only small in volume. The second thing to notice is what happens immediately after the gap. Two things tend to happen, and both are worth recognizing because they look similar from the outside but mean something different from the inside. Sometimes the gap closes and the old response arrives anyway, slightly delayed but otherwise unchanged. This is not failure. The gap appearing at all means the half-second is becoming visible to you in a way it was not before. A gap that closes today is still evidence that a gap is now capable of appearing, and a capability, once it exists, does not need to succeed every time to be real. Other times the gap holds, and something genuinely different moves through it. Not a different feeling necessarily. The fear can still be fear, the pull can still be a pull. What's different is what you do while feeling it. You stay where the old pattern would have made you leave. You ask a question where the old pattern would have made you assume. You wait a day when the old pattern would have made you decide in the heat of the moment. This second outcome is what the architecture has been building toward since the opening sentence of this hour. Not the disappearance of the groove. The groove stays exactly as deep as it has always been, while something new finally moves through it differently. Here is the part of this chapter that matters most, and it deserves to be said without ornament. This moment, when it arrives, is not proof that you have become a different person. It is proof that the same person, carrying the same groove, the same echo, the same old fear, found a half-second of room that was always technically there, and this time used it. That distinction matters because it removes a weight most people carry without naming it. The groove was never a referendum on your character. The half-second was never a test. You were failing every time the old response won. It was simply an unused room, waiting for the moment you noticed it was there. There is a second signature worth naming before this chapter closes, because it tends to arrive shortly after the first one, and it changes the texture of everything afterward. Once you have felt the gap hold even once, the next encounter with the same groove feels different before it even happens. Not because the groove softened overnight, because you now know, in your body and not only in your mind, that the gap is available. Anticipating its availability changes how tightly the old momentum grips you the next time it arrives. This is the actual mechanism behind every account of a pattern finally breaking. It rarely breaks in a single dramatic moment, despite how those stories tend to get told afterward. It breaks the way a groove always changes, gradually, through repetition, except this time the repetition is of the gap holding rather than the gap closing. None of this required forgetting to lift. None of this required tracing the old fear to its origin, or naming every person who left a deep groove in you before this lifetime began. The architecture only ever asked for the half-second, met differently, as many times as it takes. What remains, now that the moment has been named and its signature described, is the larger question this entire hour has been quietly orbiting. If the groove never fully disappears, and the leaks never fully stop, what does any of this actually add up to? Not in a single moment, across an entire life. That is the only question left. Chapter 6. What a lifetime of gaps adds up to. A single gap holding does not change a life. This needs to be said plainly, because the previous chapter could be mistaken for a promise it never made. One moment of the groove going quiet, one half-second met by something other than momentum, does not dissolve the old fear or close the deepest grooves carved before this lifetime began. Anyone who tells you a single breakthrough rewrites everything is selling something simpler than what is actually true. What changes a life is not one gap, it is what 1,000 gaps, scattered across years, slowly become. Here is the part of the architecture that only becomes visible from a distance, the way certain patterns in a landscape only resolve when you stop standing inside them and look from somewhere higher up. Each individual gap, met or missed, looks almost identical to the one before it. Small, quiet, easy to discount as having mattered at all, but a groove is not changed by any single encounter with it. A groove is changed by accumulation, the same slow process that carved it in the first place. This is worth sitting with directly. The groove was not dug in a single moment either. Whatever carved it, across however many repetitions, across however much time, across whatever came before this current lifetime, did its work the same way water carves stone. Not by force, by recurrence. The same pressure, applied again and again, in the same place, until the stone simply yields the shape the water has been asking for all along. If that is how a groove was made, that is how a groove unmakes itself. Not by force, not by a single decisive confrontation with the past, by recurrence, the gap held instead of closed, applied again and again in the same place until the groove itself begins to carry a different shape. This reframes something Chapter 5 left open. The gap holding once is not the achievement. The achievement, if there is one, is what an entire lifetime of gaps slowly becomes once enough of them have landed in the same place. Picture this across the scale of years rather than moments. In your 20s, perhaps, the old fear arrives, and the response is entirely automatic, fast, total, indistinguishable from the fear itself. A decade later, the same fear arrives in a similar circumstance, and somewhere in the response, there is now a half-second of recognition that wasn't there before, even if the recognition arrives too late to change what happens. Another decade, and the half-second has widened into something closer to a full breath. Enough room this time to choose differently before the old momentum fully takes hold. Nothing about the fear itself changed across those years. What changed is the room around it. The groove stayed exactly as deep as it has always been. What grew was your capacity to meet it without being entirely consumed by it the moment it arrived. This is the only form of resolution this architecture has ever offered, and it is worth being honest about its size, because false promises of complete dissolution tend to produce despair rather than patience. The old fear may never fully disappear. The deepest grooves, carved by whatever came before this lifetime, may never fully smooth out. What can change, slowly and only through accumulation, is the ratio between automatic response and chosen response each time the groove gets struck. That ratio is the entire measure of what this hour has been describing as growth. There is a temptation, standing inside any single difficult moment, to measure your progress against the moment itself, to ask whether this particular encounter with the groove went well or badly, as though each encounter were a final exam rather than a single data point in a much longer pattern. This temptation is worth resisting directly. A single encounter going badly does not undo the accumulated gaps that came before it. A single encounter going well does not complete the work either. Both are simply one more data point, no more decisive than any other, in a process that was never going to be resolved in a single sitting. This is also where the difference between forgetting and ordinary forgetting becomes clearest. Ordinary forgetting loses information. The forgetting this hour has been describing never loses anything. It filters weight, leaks signal, and waits for the same groove to be struck again and again across an entire lifetime, giving you another opportunity each time to meet it with something other than pure momentum. This is not cruelty disguised as design. It is the only structure that could actually produce change, because change has never come from a single confrontation. It has only ever come from repetition, met differently enough times that the pattern itself begins to shift. What this means concretely is that the moments you may currently consider your worst failures with a particular groove, the times the automatic response arrived in full, the times the gap never appeared at all, were never disqualifying. They were simply more data, added to a pattern that is still being written by a hand that includes yours. And what this means about the moments still ahead of you, the grooves not yet struck and the leaks not yet arrived, is this. Nothing about your history with a particular pattern determines your relationship with the next encounter of it. The ratio can shift at any point, in either direction, for as long as you are alive to meet the next gap when it opens. This is the closest thing to a conclusion this architecture offers, and it is worth stating without softening it into something smaller than it is. You were never asked to dissolve the forgetting. You were never asked to trace every leak back to its origin or close every groove completely. You were only ever asked to keep showing up to the half-second, as many times as it takes, for as long as it takes. That is not a small task disguised as large. It may be the only task that was ever actually yours. Chapter 7. You were never starting from nothing. There is a knowledge in you that you did not learn. You have always known this. Now you know why. The recognition that arrives before facts justify it, the fear with no traceable origin, the skill that felt less like learning and more like remembering. None of it was ever a malfunction. None of it was ever proof that something was wrong with you, or broken in you, or missing from you. It was the forgetting, doing exactly what it was built to do, filtering weight, not knowledge, and letting through precisely the signal your present circumstances were already asking for. This is worth restating plainly, because it is the claim the entire hour has been building toward, one chapter at a time. You were never starting from nothing. No one ever does. Every leak this hour has named, the echo, the ghost skill, the old fear, is evidence of a continuity that birth never actually severed. Only veiled, only filtered, never erased. This changes how certain moments in your life are allowed to be understood. The instant comfort with a stranger that made no logical sense was not random. It was a groove, already deep, finally being touched again. The fear that arrived before you had lived long enough to earn it was not irrational. It was information, missing only its file, not its truth. The competence that felt like remembering rather than learning was not luck. It was a hand finding a shape it had held before, somewhere the deliberate mind could not follow. None of this required belief in anything beyond what you have already felt. That was the quiet promise running underneath this entire hour, that every claim made here would point back to something you had already lived through, not something you were being asked to take on faith. Here is what changes now, having named all of it. The groove does not disappear. The forgetting does not lift. The half-second chapter 4 identified does not grow easier simply because you understand where it comes from. Understanding does not do the work that understanding makes possible. It only makes the work visible, which, this hour has argued from its first sentence onward, was always the actual point. You were never asked to remember everything. You were only ever asked to notice what was already leaking through and to meet it, gap by gap, with something other than pure momentum. That is not a small task disguised as large. It was named that way in the last chapter, and it is worth repeating here at the close because it is the only thing in this entire architecture that was ever actually within your reach. Not the leaks themselves, not which groove gets struck or when, only the half-second, only what moves through it once it opens. There is one more thing worth saying before this closes, and it is the thing every chapter has been quietly circling without stating outright. The fact that you are still listening, this far into an hour built entirely around unexplained recognition, originless fear, and skill that feels like memory. That fact is not incidental. Something in you was already looking for a name for this before this hour gave you one. The groove that pulled you toward this particular subject, out of every subject available to you tonight, did not arrive at random. It arrived the way every leak in this hour has arrived, because something in your present circumstances was already asking for exactly this signal. Which means the question this hour leaves you with is not abstract. It is not a thought experiment to consider later, once the audio has ended and the rest of the evening has resumed. It is the same question every chapter has been preparing you to ask the next time a groove gets struck, the next time an echo arrives wearing a face, the next time the old fear surfaces with no file attached. The next time it happens, and it will happen, because the groove was never going to stop existing, simply because you finally understood it. What will you do differently, now that you know its name? Not because the answer is owed to anyone else, not because failing to answer it well makes you a different kind of person than the one who is listening right now, only because the half-second is the only room there has ever been, for anyone, and it has always been enough room to matter. You did not arrive here by accident. You will not leave the same way you arrived. The groove is still there. It always will be. But the gap is too.